Sign the papers, Ethan. Your sister needs this money more than you do. Those were the words my father spoke less than an hour after my grandfather's will had been read, and even now I can still remember how quiet the room became afterward. My name is Ethan Walker, and until that day, I believed family disagreements had limits. I believed there were lines people would never cross, especially when grief was still fresh and everyone was supposed to be honoring the memory of someone they claimed to love. I was wrong. The attorney's office overlooked downtown Denver, and the late afternoon sunlight reflected off the glass buildings outside. The reading of the will had been surprisingly simple. My grandfather, Harold Walker, had divided his estate exactly as he wanted. There were no dramatic surprises, no secret heirs, no shocking revelations. He had left a portion to several charities, a few gifts to extended relatives, and one significant inheritance directly to me. I had spent years helping him after my grandmother passed away. I drove him to appointments, fixed things around his house, and spent countless weekends listening to stories from his past. None of it was done for money. I loved him. That was all. Yet the moment the attorney closed the folder containing the will, my parents looked at each other in a way that made me uncomfortable. It was the kind of look people exchange when they have already rehearsed a conversation. My mother folded her hands together. My father cleared his throat. Then came the request. Or rather, the demand disguised as a request. Melissa, my younger sister, was sitting beside them. Her eyes were red, though I couldn't tell whether she had been crying or simply wanted everyone to think she had. Your sister is going through a difficult time, my mother said softly. The inheritance could change everything for her. I frowned. Melissa had been going through a difficult time for most of her adult life. At least that was the explanation I heard whenever another problem appeared. A failed business venture, a maxed-out credit card, a car she couldn't afford, an apartment beyond her budget. Somehow there was always a crisis. Somehow everyone else was always expected to solve it. Grandpa left that money to me. I replied carefully. I know, my father said. But family takes care of family. The phrase sounded noble. It always did. The problem was that in our family, it only seemed to work in one direction. Melissa looked down at the floor. I didn't ask for this, she whispered. The statement immediately felt rehearsed. My mother reached over and squeezed her hand. She shouldn't have to ask. The attorney quietly excused herself, sensing the conversation was no longer legal but personal. Within seconds, I found myself standing alone against three people who had already decided what the outcome should be. My father pulled a document from a folder. We prepared something simple. A transfer agreement. I stared at the papers. My stomach tightened. They had brought documents. That meant they hadn't come hoping to discuss options. They had arrived expecting my signature. Suddenly, the entire afternoon felt different. Every sympathetic expression, every gentle word, every carefully timed pause. It all felt planned. You prepared paperwork before even speaking to me? I asked. Nobody answered directly. Melissa dabbed at the corner of her eye. My mother looked disappointed. My father looked impatient. I glanced down at the agreement. Then I noticed a date near the bottom. It had been drafted nearly 3 weeks earlier. 3 weeks before Grandpa's will had even been officially read. My heartbeat slowed. Not from fear. From realization. If they had prepared this weeks ago, then they already knew exactly what they intended to do. And for the first time, I began to wonder whether they knew something I didn't. I did not sign the document that afternoon. I told my parents I needed time to think, folded the agreement, and slipped it into my briefcase. The disappointment on my mother's face appeared instantly. My father looked annoyed. Melissa looked nervous, though she tried to hide it by staring at the carpet. Nobody argued as I left the office, but the silence followed me all the way to the parking garage. During the drive back to my townhouse, I kept thinking about that date on the transfer agreement. 3 weeks. 3 full weeks before the will reading. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Grandpa had always been private about his finances. Even family members rarely knew what decisions he planned to make. Yet somehow my parents had been confident enough to prepare legal paperwork before the inheritance details became official. That night, I placed the document on my kitchen table and studied every page again. Outside, a cold Colorado wind rattled the bare branches beyond my window. Inside, the only sound came from the hum of the refrigerator. I noticed something else. The attorney who drafted the transfer agreement was not the same attorney who handled Grandpa's estate. That detail might have meant nothing, but it stayed in my mind. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang. It was my mother. I let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, another call came from my father. Then Melissa. By midnight, I had 6 missed calls and 4 text messages. None of them asked how I was doing. None of them mentioned Grandpa. Every message focused on the money. Family helps family. Melissa is counting on you. Do the right thing. We raised you better than this. I stared at the screen for a long moment. The guilt they were trying to create felt familiar. Growing up, Melissa always seemed to receive extra understanding whenever something went wrong. If she forgot a responsibility, someone else stepped in. If she made a bad decision, someone else paid the price. If she needed help, the entire family reorganized itself around her needs. I had never questioned it much before. She was my younger sister. That was simply how things worked. But now I was beginning to see a pattern I had ignored for years. The next morning, I arrived at work exhausted. I spent most of the day reviewing software project reports, but my attention kept drifting back to the inheritance issue. Around lunchtime, I opened social media and saw a photo Melissa had posted only 2 days earlier. She was smiling beside a luxury SUV that looked practically brand new. Several comments congratulated her. One friend called it her dream vehicle. Another mentioned a recent weekend trip to Scottsdale. I stared at the picture. According to my parents, Melissa was facing a financial emergency serious enough to justify surrendering an inheritance. Yet nothing about the photograph suggested hardship. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe appearances were misleading. Still, the contradiction bothered me. That evening, another message arrived from my father. This one was different. It contained no emotional appeal. No discussion about family values. Only a short sentence. Sign the paperwork before the end of the week. Reading those words, I felt something shift inside me. The pressure was no longer subtle. It was becoming a deadline. And the harder they pushed, the more certain I became that there was something they did not want me to discover. By Thursday afternoon, I stopped wondering whether something was wrong and started asking what exactly I was missing. The pressure from my family had become impossible to ignore. Every conversation led back to the same destination. Every message carried the same expectation. Sign the paperwork. Transfer the inheritance. Help Melissa. What nobody seemed interested in discussing was why the situation required such urgency. During my lunch break, I decided to do something simple. I called Melissa. Not to argue. Not to accuse her of anything. I just wanted to hear her explanation directly. She answered on the third ring. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful for someone supposedly facing a financial disaster. When I asked how she was doing, she laughed and said she had been busy. Busy planning what? I almost asked. Instead, I mentioned the inheritance. The cheerful tone vanished immediately. She began repeating the same phrases my parents had used. Family helps family. We need to stick together. Grandpa would have wanted this. The words sounded polished, as if they had been practiced. Then I asked a question neither of my parents had answered. How much money did she actually need? There was a pause. A long one. Melissa finally gave me a number. It was substantial, but not impossible. The problem was that it did not match the figure my father had mentioned 2 days earlier. Not even close. I wrote it down after the call ended. Then I compared it to the amount in my notes from the attorney's office. The difference was nearly $40,000. I stared at the page. Maybe someone had misspoken. Maybe I was reading too much into it. Yet the inconsistencies kept growing. That evening, I opened my laptop and began searching public business records. Melissa had owned a small online retail company 3 years earlier. According to family stories, the business failed because of bad luck and economic conditions. That was the version everyone repeated. After 30 minutes of searching, I found documents showing the company had voluntarily dissolved months before its financial troubles supposedly began. That did not prove anything, but it raised another question. Why had the story changed? The next morning, I received an unexpected call at work. The number was unfamiliar. Normally, I would have ignored it, but something told me to answer. A calm older man's voice introduced himself as Daniel Mercer. At first, the name meant nothing. Then he explained that he had worked with my grandfather's financial affairs for nearly 15 years. I sat up straighter in my chair. Daniel sounded hesitant, as though he had debated whether to make the call. He told me he could not discuss confidential details. However, he said something else that caught my attention immediately. He had heard through mutual contacts that my family was pressuring me about the inheritance. When I asked how he knew that, he became quiet for a moment. Then he said, Because someone contacted me before the will reading and asked questions they should not have been asking. My pulse quickened. I looked around my office to make sure nobody was listening. Daniel did not reveal names. He did not accuse anyone directly. But he offered to meet me for coffee the following Saturday if I wanted to understand a few things about my grandfather's final months. After we ended the call, I sat motionless for several minutes. Outside my office window, snowflakes drifted across the Denver skyline. My inbox filled with routine work notifications, but I barely noticed them. For the first time, an independent person connected to Grandpa's affairs had entered the picture. And something about his voice told me he knew far more than he was willing to say over the phone. Saturday arrived gray and cold. A thin layer of snow covered the sidewalks outside the coffee shop Daniel had chosen, a quiet place tucked between a bookstore and a small insurance office in an older part of Denver. I arrived 10 minutes early and found a table near the window. As people passed outside carrying steaming cups and bundled scarves, I kept wondering whether I was overreacting. Maybe there was a simple explanation for everything. Maybe the inconsistencies, the pressure, and the strange timing were nothing more than unfortunate coincidences. Then Daniel walked through the door. He looked to be in his late 60s, dressed neatly in a dark winter coat and carrying a worn leather folder under one arm. His handshake was firm, and his expression carried the calm confidence of someone who had spent decades handling sensitive information. After ordering coffee, he sat down across from me and studied me carefully. "You remind me of your grandfather," he said. "He always paid attention to details." The comment stayed with me. Daniel did not rush into the conversation. Instead, he spoke about Grandpa Harold for several minutes. He talked about the years they had worked together, about Harold's discipline, his careful planning, and his belief that every important decision should be documented. Nothing about Grandpa sounded like a man who left confusion behind. Finally, Daniel opened the folder. He did not remove any documents, but he rested his hand on the cover. "There are things I cannot legally disclose," he said. "However, I can tell you that your grandfather became concerned during the last year of his life." My chest tightened. Concerned about what? Daniel looked out the window for a moment before answering. Pressure. The word landed heavily between us. He explained that several conversations had taken place regarding future inheritance expectations. Certain family members had repeatedly tried to predict what Harold planned to do with his estate. According to Daniel, Grandpa disliked those discussions and often changed the subject. He believed inheritances should never become assumptions, Daniel said. He thought expectations created entitlement. I immediately thought about my parents and Melissa. Daniel continued carefully. A few months before Grandpa passed away, someone had requested information about assets they were not authorized to access. The request had been denied. Again, Daniel would not identify anyone directly, but the implication was difficult to ignore. Did Grandpa know about those requests? I asked. Daniel nodded. Yes, he knew. The answer sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the weather outside. For years I had viewed the inheritance as something distant and uncertain. Apparently, other people had been thinking about it much earlier. Then Daniel said something that changed everything. A week before the final estate review, your grandfather added additional notes to his file. I leaned forward. What kind of notes? Daniel gave a small smile. The kind written by a man who wanted his intentions to survive any future disputes. My pulse quickened. Until that moment, I had assumed the transfer agreement prepared by my parents was merely opportunistic. Now a different possibility emerged. What if they already suspected Grandpa had taken steps specifically designed to prevent interference? What if their urgency was not about helping Melissa at all? Daniel finished his coffee and closed the folder. Before leaving, he handed me a business card. "You did not hear any confidential information from me today," he said. "But if someone starts making claims about what your grandfather wanted, make sure they can prove it." As I watched him walk out into the falling snow, I realized the situation was far larger than a family disagreement. And for the first time, I began to suspect that Grandpa had anticipated this conflict long before any of us knew it was coming. The following week felt different. The pressure from my family did not disappear, but my reaction to it changed. Before meeting Daniel, every phone call had left me feeling defensive. Now I found myself listening more carefully. I paid attention to details, to contradictions, to the small things people revealed when they believed their story would never be questioned. On Tuesday evening, my parents invited me to dinner. The invitation sounded casual, but I knew better. The moment I walked into their house, I sensed the purpose of the gathering. Melissa was already there, sitting at the kitchen island with a mug of tea in front of her. My mother greeted me warmly. My father offered a brief nod. Nobody mentioned Grandpa. Nobody asked about work. Within 10 minutes, the conversation returned to the inheritance. Melissa has been under tremendous stress, my mother said. You cannot imagine what she has been dealing with. I looked at my sister. Then help me understand. Melissa lowered her eyes. Some things are personal. The answer immediately struck me as strange. The situation was apparently serious enough to justify transferring a substantial inheritance, yet suddenly the details were too personal to discuss. My father stepped in before I could respond. The specifics are not important. What matters is helping family. There was that phrase again. Family helps family. Family comes first. Family sacrifices. I noticed something then. Every argument focused on emotion. Not facts. Not numbers. Not documents. Just feelings. After dinner, while my mother cleared plates from the table, Melissa stepped outside to take a phone call. Through the kitchen window, I watched her pacing across the backyard. She was smiling. Not the smile of someone overwhelmed by financial hardship. Not the smile of someone facing a crisis. It was relaxed, carefree, comfortable. The image stayed with me long after I returned home. Later that night, curiosity got the better of me. I began searching public records again. This time, I focused on property information. What I found surprised me. 6 months earlier, Melissa had signed a lease for a luxury apartment in one of Denver's most expensive neighborhoods. The monthly rent alone exceeded what many families paid for a mortgage. I stared at the listing information. According to my parents, Melissa was barely holding things together. Yet somehow she could afford amenities, underground parking, and a rooftop pool. Maybe someone was helping her financially. Maybe there was another explanation. But the gap between the story and the evidence continued to grow. 2 days later, another unexpected piece fell into place. An old family friend, named Carol Jensen, called me after hearing rumors about the inheritance dispute. Carol had known Grandpa for more than 20 years. During our conversation, she casually mentioned seeing Melissa and my parents at a country club fundraiser only a few weeks before Grandpa passed away. What caught my attention was not the event itself. It was Carol's description of their conversation. They seemed very confident about future plans, she said, almost as if they already knew how everything would turn out. After the call ended, I sat quietly in my living room. Snow drifted past the windows while the city lights glowed against the dark sky. Daniel's warning echoed in my mind. Grandpa had become concerned. Someone had been asking questions they should not have been asking. Additional notes had been added to his files shortly before his death. Piece by piece, a picture was beginning to form. And the more clearly I saw it, the less this looked like a desperate effort to help my sister. It was starting to look like a plan that had been in motion long before Grandpa's final wishes were ever revealed. The following Monday, I made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable only a month earlier. Instead of responding to my parents, I contacted an estate attorney of my own. Until then, I had been treating the situation like a family disagreement. A painful one, certainly, but still a private matter that could eventually be resolved through conversation. The attorney changed that perspective within the first 30 minutes of our meeting. Her name was Rebecca Lawson, and she listened carefully as I explained everything that had happened since the will reading. She reviewed the transfer agreement my parents had prepared. She examined the dates. She read the messages they had sent. When she finished, she folded her hands and asked a question nobody else had asked. Why are they so determined to obtain this inheritance immediately? I stared at her. That was exactly the question I had been asking myself. Rebecca explained that genuine financial emergencies usually come with documentation. Medical bills, loan notices, tax records, court filings, something concrete. Yet every explanation I had received from my family relied on emotion rather than evidence. Before I left her office, she advised me not to sign anything and not to engage in further negotiations without documentation. 2 days later, the situation escalated. My father arrived unannounced at my townhouse. When I opened the door, he stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. His expression was different from anything I had seen before. The patience was gone. So was the warmth. He looked frustrated. This has gone on long enough, he said. Your mother is exhausted. Melissa is overwhelmed. You are dragging this out for no reason. I remained calm. Then show me the reason. He He frowned. What does that mean? Show me the records. The debt. The bills. Whatever emergency requires this inheritance. For several seconds, he simply stared at me. Then he looked away. It was a small reaction, but I noticed it immediately. My father had always maintained eye contact when he believed he was right. Eventually, he changed the subject entirely. He began talking about loyalty, gratitude, family obligations, everything except the evidence I requested. After he left, I felt more certain than ever that I was moving in the right direction. The next surprise arrived on Friday afternoon. Rebecca called me directly. Her tone was professional, but there was an urgency beneath it. She informed me that a legal petition had been filed. My parents and Melissa were formally challenging aspects of the estate distribution. For a moment, I could not speak. The inheritance they claimed was about helping family had suddenly become a legal dispute. Rebecca continued explaining the details. According to the filing, they intended to argue that Grandpa's true intentions had not been properly reflected and that extraordinary circumstances justified transferring a significant portion of the inheritance. I sat in silence after the call ended. Outside my office window, the city moved normally. Cars flowed through intersections. Pedestrians crossed streets carrying shopping bags and coffee cups. Yet my own world felt strangely different. The conflict was no longer happening through phone calls and family dinners. It had entered a courtroom. Then I remembered Daniel's final words. If someone starts making claims about what your grandfather wanted, make sure they can prove it. As I stared at the legal notice on my desk, I realized that sooner or later someone would have to present evidence. And I was beginning to suspect that evidence might not support the story my family had spent weeks trying to sell. The first court conference took place 3 weeks later. I had never been involved in estate litigation before, and walking into the courthouse that morning felt surreal. The building itself was quiet, almost ordinary. People carried folders, spoke in low voices, and waited patiently on wooden benches. Nothing about it resembled the dramatic courtroom scenes people imagine from television. Yet beneath that calm atmosphere, I could feel the weight of what was happening. My parents sat together near the front of the room. Melissa sat beside them. None of them acknowledged me when I arrived. The distance between us felt larger than the few feet separating our seats. Rebecca organized her files carefully and remained focused. She had spent the previous week reviewing every document connected to Grandpa's estate. Whenever I expressed frustration about how personal the situation felt, she reminded me of something important. Courts do not decide cases based on pressure, guilt, or family expectations. They rely on facts. That thought became my anchor. When the proceedings began, I listened carefully. My family's attorney presented their position with confidence. He described Melissa's circumstances as extraordinary. He suggested that Grandpa would have wanted flexibility. He spoke about fairness, compassion, and family responsibility. The argument sounded polished. If I had not lived through the past several weeks myself, I might have found it convincing. Then Rebecca stood and calmly asked for supporting documentation. The room became noticeably quieter. Specific records, she explained. Financial statements. Verified obligations. Evidence supporting the claims being presented. The response that followed surprised me. The other side requested additional time. More time to gather information. More time to organize records. More time to clarify details. Rebecca simply nodded and returned to her seat. She looked neither surprised nor concerned. During a short recess, I stepped into the hallway and stared through a tall window overlooking downtown Denver. Snow had melted earlier that week, leaving the streets wet and reflective beneath the afternoon sun. As I stood there, Daniel's words returned to me once again. Grandpa had anticipated disputes. Grandpa had documented his intentions. Grandpa believed important decisions should survive challenges. For the first time, I began wondering whether there was something in those final notes that nobody had fully discussed yet. When the hearing resumed, another unexpected moment occurred. The estate attorney who had originally handled Grandpa's will appeared briefly to answer procedural questions. While her testimony remained limited, one statement caught everyone's attention. She confirmed that Grandpa had reviewed and reaffirmed portions of his estate planned shortly before his death. Not years earlier. Not decades earlier. Shortly before. I watched my father's expression change. It lasted only a second, but I noticed it. Melissa looked down at the table. My mother folded her arms tightly across her chest. The hearing eventually concluded without a final decision. Another date was scheduled. More records would be requested. More evidence would be reviewed. On paper, very little had happened. Yet as Rebecca and I walked out of the courthouse together, she offered a small smile. "Did you notice what was missing?" she asked. I thought about the arguments, the requests, and the explanations. Then I understood. Throughout the entire proceeding, despite all the emotional claims being made, nobody had produced a single document proving the emergency that supposedly justified taking the inheritance. And as we stepped into the cold afternoon air, I realized the burden was no longer on me to explain anything. It was on them. The second hearing took place nearly a month later. By then, the atmosphere had changed completely. During the weeks leading up to it, Rebecca had gathered additional records, reviewed financial filings, and organized every piece of information connected to the estate. Meanwhile, my parents became increasingly distant. The occasional phone calls stopped. The messages stopped. Even Melissa disappeared from social media for a while. It felt as though everyone was waiting for the same moment. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and clear. Sunlight reflected off patches of snow that still lingered along the sidewalks outside the courthouse. As I entered the building, I noticed my parents already seated inside the courtroom. My mother looked tired. My father appeared tense. Melissa sat between them, staring at the table in front of her. The confidence I had seen during the early days of the dispute seemed noticeably weaker now. Once the proceedings began, the judge reviewed the filings and listened patiently as both sides summarized their positions. The arguments sounded familiar. Melissa was struggling. The family wanted fairness. Extraordinary circumstances existed. I had heard the same claims for months. What interested me was not what they said. It was what they still could not prove. Rebecca remained calm throughout the discussion. She asked precise questions and allowed the facts to speak for themselves. Then the conversation turned toward documentation, financial obligations, outstanding liabilities, supporting evidence. The judge reviewed several exhibits before looking toward the attorney representing my parents and sister. The courtroom became very quiet. Even the rustling of papers seemed to stop. Then came the question that changed everything. "Where is the proof?" the judge asked. The words were not dramatic. They were not loud. Yet they seemed to hang in the room longer than anything else spoken that day. The attorney began explaining that additional circumstances existed beyond the available records. The judge listened politely. Then she repeated the question. "Do you have documentation supporting these claims?" A long pause followed. I looked toward Melissa. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair. My father stared straight ahead. My mother lowered her eyes. For months, every conversation had revolved around urgency, responsibility, sacrifice, family duty. Yet now, when evidence was required, those arguments suddenly seemed fragile. Rebecca then presented several documents that painted a very different picture. Property records, lease information, financial disclosures, public filings. None of them suggested the type of emergency that had been described. None supported the narrative that had been used to pressure me. The judge reviewed each item carefully. Her expression remained neutral, but I noticed how frequently she returned to the absence of supporting proof from the other side. The hearing continued for another hour. Questions were asked. Clarifications were requested. More records were discussed. Yet the central issue never changed. One side had documentation. The other had explanations. As the session drew to a close, the judge announced that additional materials connected to Grandpa's estate file would be reviewed before a final ruling. That statement immediately caught my attention. So did the reaction from my family. My father's jaw tightened slightly. Melissa looked genuinely worried for the first time. Walking out of the courthouse that afternoon, I felt neither triumph nor relief. What I felt was certainty. The story I had been told since the day of the will reading was beginning to unravel. And whatever Grandpa had placed in those final estate notes was about to become very important. The final hearing arrived on a bright spring morning, nearly 4 months after the dispute had begun. By then, the stress that once consumed my thoughts had settled into something quieter. I no longer spent my nights wondering what my family might say next. I no longer replayed old conversations searching for hidden meanings. The facts were finally taking center stage, exactly as Rebecca had predicted from the beginning. When I entered the courtroom, I noticed the atmosphere felt different from the previous hearings. There was less confidence on one side of the room and more anticipation throughout the entire courtroom. My parents sat silently. Melissa avoided looking in my direction. The judge reviewed several documents before addressing the attorneys. Then she turned her attention to the additional estate materials that had been requested. The estate attorney who had worked with Grandpa Harold was called forward once more. This time, she brought a file containing notes made during Grandpa's final estate review. The room became very still as she explained that Grandpa had personally requested those notes be preserved with the estate records. According to her testimony, he had become increasingly concerned about assumptions being made regarding his assets. He wanted there to be no confusion about his intentions. Then one of the notes was read into the record. I will never forget the words. Grandpa had written that his inheritance decisions reflected years of observation, personal judgment, and deliberate planning. He specifically stated that no beneficiary should feel pressured to surrender their inheritance to satisfy the expectations of another family member. My father slowly lowered his head. My mother stared at the table. Melissa looked as though the air had left the room. The judge continued reviewing the materials. Additional notes revealed that Grandpa had discussed concerns about entitlement and repeated attempts by certain individuals to anticipate or influence future distributions. He had documented those concerns carefully, not emotionally, not angrily, just clearly. The contrast was impossible to ignore. For months I had been told what Grandpa supposedly would have wanted. Now the court was reading what he had actually written. Rebecca then presented one final summary of the financial records already entered into evidence. The documents showed no extraordinary emergency, no hidden crisis, no justification for overriding Grandpa's stated wishes. The judge listened patiently before delivering her decision. She explained that personal preferences and family disagreements could not replace documented intent. She noted the complete lack of evidence supporting the claims used to challenge the inheritance. Most importantly, she emphasized that the court's responsibility was to honor the wishes of the person who created the estate plan. The challenge was denied. The inheritance remained exactly where Grandpa intended it to remain. Nobody spoke for several seconds after the ruling. The silence felt heavier than any argument that had occurred during the case. As people slowly gathered their belongings, I looked toward my family. I expected anger, perhaps disappointment. Instead, I saw something closer to embarrassment. The story they had repeated for months had collapsed under the weight of a simple requirement: proof. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun warmed the concrete steps as people moved through the city around us. Rebecca shook my hand and congratulated me. Daniel later called to say that Grandpa would have been proud of how I handled everything. Yet the greatest lesson had nothing to do with winning. What stayed with me was the realization that truth rarely needs pressure, manipulation, or urgency. Truth survives questions. Truth survives scrutiny. Truth survives evidence. As I walked away from the courthouse that afternoon, I understood something I had not fully grasped before. I had not lost my family during those months. The conflict simply revealed who they had been all along. And thanks to Grandpa's careful planning, the facts finally spoke louder than anyone else ever could.